You're listening to Yoked, Conversations with Real-Life Yogis. I'm Kelly Sunrose, your host. The mission of this podcast is to share the teachings of yoga as applied to everyday life by real people through interviews, conversations, Q&A sessions, and more. Learn more at yokedpodcast.com. Hi everybody, it's Kelly and welcome to today's episode of Yoked. It's really good to be back together. Today I will be answering a listener question. I'm really excited to do that. I always love receiving questions. So if you have one or many, email me at sunroseyoga@gmail.com and I'll do my best to answer promptly. So before we begin today, let's talk about a little bit of news, a couple of things that are happening or are on the horizon. First, I have some new practices up in the Sunrose Yoga Shop. First, we have Spectrum, which is a subtle body exploration, and that is video, audio meditations, practices, and a PDF book all about the subtle body and the chakras. And then also I have a new meditation collection up called Cosmic Spiral. 3 meditations, 1 sound bath. So if you're interested in that or any of the other practices that we have up in the Sunrose Yoga Shop, feel free to head on over there, sunroseyoga.com. Also, just as a reminder, every month I donate 15% of my income to organizations and funds that align with my mission and the mission of the podcast and teaching. And this month, in May, I'll be donating 15% of my income to Oceana and Families for Children. Bhakti Foster Purvine talked about Families for Children in our last episode. They do amazing work in Southwest Asia. And Oceana does amazing work for the ocean. And super happy to support these 2 organizations. To see all the organizations that we've supported, check out the mission statement over at my website, sunroseyoga.com. If you would like to recommend an organization, please connect via the contact page. Thank you. Finally, just putting the word out there as we're deep in our spring immersion right now. I'm thinking ahead to our fall immersion. And this year, it'll take place in November and December, and we'll focus on taking our pranayama practice deeper. So stay tuned for that. Finally, the Wildcat Yoga Club. This is our online yoga community. The clubhouse contains an ever-expanding library of audio and video practices, plus lectures, tutorials, video Q&A sessions, and we have monthly online workshops in meditation, active listening, and embodied voice. Membership in the club also includes discounts on all of my courses, retreats, and products in the Sunrose Yoga Shop. All of this for $150 per year or $15 per month. Connect with the yoga of your real life by visiting www.wildcatyogaclub.com. Thanks for being here. Love. So today's show answers a listener question about how long to stay in each pose when practicing at home. And we talked about cultivating a home yoga practice back in October. And I gave a few of my favorite general guidelines for starting and maintaining a home practice then. That episode focused primarily on the question, what poses should I do? And I recommended, which I still do, choosing 5 poses. You can find a link to the whole post and listen to that episode in today's show notes. But today I'd like to focus primarily on the question, how long should I stay in each pose? Now, I think this is an amazing question. And although it seems really simple on the surface, it speaks volumes about our overall engagement with the practice. My short answer to this question, as annoying as it may be, is it depends. Now, personally, when I began my asana practice 20 years ago, I could not hold a pose. I mean, physically, I could hold a pose. I was young, strong, and flexible, blah, blah, blah. However, staying in a pose for even 5 breaths was simply not possible for my mental and emotional state. I mean, I was wound up, to say the least. Hanging out in a pose without someone telling me 47 precise alignment cues was just so scary. I had to be alone with my thoughts. And at that time, even though I had a lot of body awareness with respect to action, like you could say, do this thing, and I could do it, I had nearly no skills at actually feeling what I felt in my body. Now, this is my favorite part of my practice, which is called interoception. And I had no capacity for concentrating on those real feelings. Like, I couldn't even get interested in what was actually happening because I was so in my head. So I moved. I flowed with my breath until I could find my body, until I could rest in my body. And, incidentally, until I got the classic Ashtanga Vinyasa rotator cuff injury and couldn't practice for a while. But that's another story for another day. My point is, until my body and my mind were ready, I needed to move quickly from pose to pose, and you might be in this boat as well. Now, it might not be the classic Ashtanga Vinyasa practice. It might be moving from, essential or simple movements on a breath-by-breath basis. So after about 10 years of practice had calmed my nervous system down enough to be able to hold poses. Now, as an aside, I am only kind of joking. I feel like I talk about this a lot when I'm teaching brand new meditators and people who are making the transition from a vinyasa-based practice to a longer held practice. Like, it can take a while. It doesn't always take that long, but it took me a long time. So after 10 years, I could stay in the poses longer. At that time, I usually set some sort of arbitrary system of holding, like, okay, today I'm going to hold all of these poses for 5 to 10 breaths. And also by this time, personally, I had transitioned into an alignment-based flow practice. So even though, I was following the model that we might associate with vinyasa, I was slowing it way down and also really focusing on at that time, Anusara general principles of alignment. So if I was holding a shape for 10 breaths, I went through a checklist of alignment cues to focus on in order to, optimize the pose. For me, in other words, it was to continue to avoid actually feeling my personal sensation palette. And even though the cues were in some sense, in a sense, safer than my Ashtanga practice had been, they were very much based on conforming the body to the pose rather than finding my interior aliveness. And they weren't at all about finding an alignment that reminded me of my innate connection to all life. So it was still even though there were many internal alignment cues, it was based on an external, visual experience of the pose. But the process is unfolding. The yoga was happening. I wouldn't change this for anything. After I gave birth, my movement practice shifted. And when I say my movement practice shifted, I mean my whole life shifted. But that too is another story. And I started practicing a bit of Feldenkrais with my asana and moving into a subtler state of awareness. And for me, because so much of mothering a tiny baby and growing baby and toddler required really being with things exactly as they were, I became more interested in exploring the sensations that were coming up in my own body. And this was sort of like, some assumptions that I had made even prior to giving birth. It was always sort of like, if you do these things, you will feel a certain way. If you chant these mantras, you will have an easier birth. And still, for me, the markers were all external up until that point. And it wasn't until, I had this intense and empowering birthing experience with my daughter Una, where, I literally lifted weights and did a hardcore yoga practice the morning that I went into labor. So I was in very tough shape physically, and I was chanting all of these mantras, and, I had been eating a certain way. I still had a really long birth, and that experience and the birth of my daughter, I did all of the things that you're, in quotes, supposed to do, and it was still really hard. And she, still had her own idea of how things were going to go, even from the beginning. That really opened up the practice for me in a totally new way. It became less prescriptive and more exploratory. Like, it really, even though I knew, the teachings of Vairagya, the teachings of non-attachment, like, I didn't really know that until those moments. And so I really, started to embrace the practice of, not having an answer. Anyway, okay. So my practices are shifting big time. I'm becoming more interested in exploring sensations that are coming up in my own body. And I was also noticing how many conventional alignment cues seemed to fight my natural physiology as a woman in this particular body. And what I mean by that is, I would get into perfect alignment of poses and find that the experience was detrimental to my own body. I would do a pose the way I was supposed to do it, and it caused, various kinds of joint instability or various, overuse or underuse of certain muscle groups. And then also, I found that my awareness started to become more refined, and I would notice how practicing in a certain way, even if I did it to the letter the way I was supposed to, led to mental and emotional responses that didn't follow the quote-unquote benefits that were touted by various yoga resources. And I realized I needed to become and needed to realize that there is more wisdom in my own experience than I was previously aware of or giving myself or my students credit for. And this goes for everyone listening, by the way. It's not just me. I'm not special. This is every single human, every single being for that matter. So at this time, I started practicing this blend of somatic yoga therapy, and it was really useful, particularly in reconnecting with my core, and not just in a generic flatten your abs way, but knowing and feeling my way into parts of the body that were drastically changed by growing and pushing out a human. And so at this time, I started developing this framework for being in the body. And 3 question groups emerged. And those were, first, how do I do this? Answered from the body, not the mind. What do I feel? Where do I feel it? What does it feel like? And finally, what happens if? What happens if I don't square my hips in Warrior 1? Or what happens if, I angle my foot ever so slightly differently? What happens if I, let more weight drop into the ball of the foot than the pinky toe, than the heel? So approaching the shapes with questions rather than answers really changed things for me. Incidentally, I now think that this is the only ethical way to teach, and I totally call bullshit on anyone who tries to tell another being, A, what they should feel in a pose, and B, what the result of any experience will be. I think this kind of suggestion keeps students from having their own experiences by tainting the experiment with suggested results. And furthermore, although I can offer guidance based on my own experience and the collective experience of all of my teachers and the teachings, I cannot know how things will play out in this particular moment under current circumstances for anyone. And, that's not just for me. I hold to that. Okay, anyway, back on track. So it was also during this postpartum time that I began to experiment with yin yoga, where the holds are much, much longer. And embedded within the yin yoga practice is learning how to be with the mind in its discomfort and how to inventory the body's sensation library. And during this time for me, the sensation / analytical framework that emerged was, what do I feel in the body? Where do I feel the breath? Where do I go in the mind? And when? Now, all of this is super useful in the practice. And I think when you're trying to determine how long to stay in the pose, ask yourself these questions. what's happening in the body and go from body part to body part. Where do I feel the breath? Where is my mind trying to go? When is it going there? Is it when things are boring? Is it when things get hard? Is that when I check out? And I've found too that this is just as useful in real life. Asking these questions no matter what you're doing. Like for me, I have this frustrating puppy right now, asking myself what I feel in the body and where I feel my breath while we're out on a walk and she's pulling me or, trying to bite her own leash is super useful. And the data, the collecting of the data allows for a more complete experience for whatever we're in. Because we're present. We're attending to what is actually happening. Now, also during this time, I found that the more time and effort I devote to my breathing and meditation practice, the more my capacity for feeling and deep knowing develops and increases. Other questions that I think are supremely useful to return to over and over again are, why do I practice yoga? How is this supporting that purpose? And sometimes you'll discover some real conflicts between the answer to those questions and your overall approach. And that's not a bad thing. The discovery is the yoga. Now, sort of practically speaking, there can also be seasonal factors to consider. So if you're feeling sluggish, you might experiment with some quicker transitions. Quick always being a relative term. And if you're feeling ungrounded, then you'll want to be sure to include at least a few longer held shapes, preferably some restorative shapes, preferably where something is giving you some weight. Although if you're super ungrounded, you may need to flow a little bit first. Finally, when you're, taking a look at your home practice and you're deciding what to do, how long to do it, look to what you are avoiding. Like for me in the beginning, I was avoiding holding and I was avoiding feeling. And I'm not suggesting that your practice needs to become like a torture chamber or that you should make things as difficult as possible. But, we're looking for the razor's edge, like where am I sort of staying stuck in an old pattern? What am I protecting by continuing to do things this certain way? So if you find yourself avoiding something, ask yourself what about it is repelling you, and then look for the reason behind that and the reason behind that. For example, if you, like me, at a long time ago, avoid longer holds because, you just got to get your workout in. This is an answer I would have given a long time ago. Ask yourself why. And then ask yourself why to the answer to that question. And keep going. And then you might get to sort of the scaffolding of an answer. And maybe in that place you ask, what if I hold space for the possibility that something else might be true? And if you discover, oh, really, I can't be in the poses because my mind is just making me crazy with its overactivity, then work on the mind. And this goes, this can go both ways. We can get to a place in our practice where, We are avoiding challenging ourselves because we have set up certain limitations, like, well, I'm never going to be able to do it a certain way, so then I shouldn't, work at this certain shape at all. There's nothing for me there. Well, what if there was something else that might be true in that moment? What if there's something more at play than the attainment of the pose? Bottom line, stay curious. Trust your own experience. Find teachers that you really trust and that know their stuff, but listen to your own experience always. And look for questions rather than answers. This has been really fun. I hope it's helpful. If you have a question or a topic for discussion, email me, sunroseyoga@gmail.com. Thank you so much for being here. Love. Thanks so much for listening to today's podcast. Complete show notes are available at yokedpodcast.com. Please feel free to connect by emailing me at sunroseyoga@gmail.com. Today's episode is made possible by the Wildcat Yoga Club, our online yoga community. The clubhouse contains an ever-expanding library of audio and video practices, plus lectures, tutorials, and video Q&A sessions, plus monthly online workshops in meditation, active listening, and embodied voice. Membership also includes discounts on all courses, retreats, and products in the Sunrose Yoga Shop. All of this for $15 a month or $150 per year. Connect with the yoga of real life by visiting www.wildcatyogaclub.com. Thanks.